In Riverside, a small and quiet town where everyone knew each other, the day began like any other. The town wasn't particularly remarkable, but it had its charms. The local diner where people gathered each morning for coffee, the main street lined with mom and pop shops, and the friendly nods exchanged between neighbors on their way to work. Riverside's police department was small, tight-knit, and generally respected in the community. Officer Ray Collins was among its longest-serving members, a man known for his stern demeanor and unwavering belief in the law. Though respected, Collins had a reputation for being strict, sometimes unyielding. He prided himself on knowing nearly every local face, believing his role was to protect the town from outside influences that could disrupt its peace. Meanwhile, Captain James Thornton, a police captain from the neighboring city, was on his way to Riverside for a family commitment. Thornton was highly regarded in his department, known for his fair but firm approach to policing and his dedication to community outreach. Although his family had moved to Riverside to escape the pressures of city life, Thornton commuted back and forth to his job in the city. This was one of those rare days when he managed to carve out time for his family, rushing to pick up his young son from school before heading to a family gathering planned for the evening. He wore civilian clothes and drove his personal car, hoping to blend in and enjoy a day away from the stress of work. As he entered Riverside, he noticed a patrol car pulling out from a side street and beginning to follow him. The car stayed behind him for several blocks, and Thornton could feel the officer's eyes on him. This wasn't his first time being watched carefully in Riverside, but today it felt different, more intense. He checked his speed, drove carefully, and waited, hoping the officer would lose interest and let him be. But just as he turned onto the road leading to his son's school, he saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. Thornton pulled over calmly, exhaling slowly as he prepared himself. He knew the drill, knew what was likely coming. As a police captain, he had worked tirelessly to address issues of racial profiling and biased policing in his department, but now he found himself on the other side of the uniform, uncertain of what this stop would bring. Officer Collins stepped out of his patrol car, his expression stern as he approached Thornton's car. He tapped on the window, and Thornton rolled it down. "License and registration," Collins said, his tone flat but with an undercurrent of authority. Thornton handed over his documents without a word, deciding to observe how Collins would handle the situation. Collins examined the documents, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the address on Thornton's driver's license. "What brings you to Riverside, Mr. Thornton?" he asked, emphasizing the Mr. with a hint of suspicion. "I live here with my family," Thornton replied, his tone neutral. "I'm on my way to pick up my son from school." Collins's eyes moved back to the license, then scanned the car, as if expecting to find something amiss. "Do you mind telling me what you were doing driving through the residential area back there?" "I was taking the shortcut," Thornton replied, still calm. "I'm running a bit late." Collins let out a low hum of skepticism. "Seems like an unusual route for someone who lives here," he said, his eyes still probing Thornton's face, searching for a sign of nervousness or dishonesty. Thornton's calm composure seemed to unsettle them, adding a layer of tension to the air between them. As Collins continued to question him, a small crowd began to gather nearby, drawn by the unusual sight of a traffic stop involving someone they didn't immediately recognize. People whispered, some wondering why the officer was interrogating a man who seemed so composed and polite, while others exchanged glances, sensing something was off. Minutes passed, and Collins's questions grew increasingly pointed, bordering on accusatory. He asked Thornton where he worked, why he wasn't in a marked vehicle, and if he had any business in this part of town. Each question struck a nerve, but Thornton held his ground, answering calmly without giving away his identity as a captain. He wanted to see how far this would go, not out of pride, but because he knew that if this was happening to him, it was likely happening to others without his privilege of status. Then Collins asked him to step out of the car, explaining he needed to conduct a routine search. Thornton hesitated, weighing his options. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but he also felt a simmering anger at the unnecessary humiliation he was being put through. He could feel the eyes of the bystanders on him, some of whom were recording the interaction with their phones. Still, he complied, stepping out of the car as Collins began to search it. Inside, Collins found nothing unusual, but he continued to look, almost desperate to uncover something that would justify his actions. Thornton watched, his patience wearing thin, but he knew the importance of maintaining control. Collins, however, seemed unfazed by the onlookers, his focus entirely on proving his suspicions correct. Finally, as Collins finished his fruitless search, Thornton decided to end the charade. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his badge, holding it up so that Collins could see it clearly. "Officer Collins," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I am Captain James Thornton from the neighboring city's police department. I would appreciate it if you could explain the reason for this stop." The crowd fell silent, their eyes widening as they processed this revelation. Collins's face drained of color as he registered Thornton's rank and authority. For a brief moment, he was speechless, caught between surprise and embarrassment. He quickly composed himself, attempting to brush off his actions with a dismissive tone. "Well, you should have mentioned that from the start," he muttered, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Thornton didn't let him off so easily. "Why would my job matter here, officer? Shouldn't everyone in this community be treated with the same respect, regardless of their position?" His question hung in the air, pointed and powerful, cutting through the silence like a knife. The onlookers watched, some nodding in agreement, others still trying to process what they had just witnessed. Collins stammered, struggling to find an answer. I was just doing my job," he managed to say, but the words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. Thornton gave him a measured look, his expression a blend of disappointment and quiet resolve. He pocketed his badge and turned to the crowd, addressing them directly. "This is not just about me," he said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs. "It's about everyone in this town, about whether we want a community that welcomes everyone or one that treats people with suspicion based on appearance alone." The impact of his words lingered as he climbed back into his car, leaving Collins to face the judgment of the watching crowd. Thornton drove away, feeling the adrenaline coursing through him, knowing that this incident would not end here. It was only the beginning of a conversation Riverside had avoided for too long, and he was prepared to see it through. As he pulled up to his son's school, he saw his young boy waiting, waving excitedly. He forced a smile, trying to shake off the lingering frustration, but he knew that what had just happened would stay with him. More importantly, he knew it would ripple through the community, raising questions and sparking discussions that could no longer be ignored. As Captain James Thornton drove away from the tense traffic stop, he couldn't shake the frustration simmering within him. The questions and accusations from Officer Ray Collins echoed in his mind. Thornton had faced incidents like this before, but something about today felt different, more personal. This wasn't some stranger on the highway pulling him over. This was his own town, the place where he had chosen to raise his family, where he believed he could be just another resident rather than Captain Thornton. The fact that Collins was still able to treat him with such open suspicion, even after revealing his status, gnawed at him. As he approached his son's school, he tried to refocus. His son, Jason, was a bright kid, curious and quick-witted. He'd heard the stories his father told about justice and fairness, and grew up admiring the idea of being someone who could protect and help others. Thornton worried that if Jason ever knew what had just happened, it would shatter the idealized image he held of his father's job. In Jason's eyes, the police were always the good guys, the ones who stopped bad things from happening. And while Thornton wanted to preserve that innocence, he knew that one day his son would have to understand the complexities and injustices that existed, even in the systems they were taught to trust. When Thornton pulled up, he saw Jason waiting by the curb, waving excitedly. He forced a smile and got out of the car to greet his son, who immediately launched into a story about his day at school. Thornton listened with a warm smile, letting the sound of his son's voice wash away some of the anger. For a brief moment, he could almost forget the events of the last half hour. But when they got back in the car, his thoughts drifted back to the encounter, the memory still fresh and raw. He glanced in the rearview mirror, noticing how the faces of the people who had gathered lingered in his mind. He could still see the mixture of shock and quiet anger in their eyes, and he wondered what they must have thought of the incident. Did they see it as a one-time mishap, a simple misunderstanding? Or did they understand the deeper implications of what had just transpired? On the drive home, Thornton made a detour through the downtown area, past the local diner and grocery store, where people were often gathered. He wasn't surprised to see small groups already talking about the incident. Riverside was a small town, and news traveled fast. He spotted several familiar faces, some nodding at him as he passed, their expressions a mix of sympathy and concern. He knew the town would soon be buzzing with opinions, divided as they always were when issues of race and authority surfaced. Thornton understood he was no longer just a private resident. He had inadvertently become a symbol in this conversation, a reluctant leader for those who felt Riverside wasn't as inclusive or welcoming as it claimed to be. Later that evening, as Thornton sat down with his family for dinner, the doorbell rang. His wife, Denise, glanced at him with a knowing look, understanding immediately what it might be about. Since moving to Riverside, she had noticed the subtleties, the uncomfortable glances, the casual questions about where they were really from, and the subtle judgments that followed. She had hoped that one day people would get to know them beyond appearances, but incidents like this seemed to push those hopes farther away. Thornton opened the door to find his neighbor, Sam, standing on the porch. Sam was a local business owner, someone who prided himself on being community-minded, and he was visibly uneasy. "Evening, James," he started, scratching his head. I wanted to check on you. Heard about what happened today. People are talking, you know." Thornton invited Sam in, and they sat down in the living room, talking in hushed tones, while Denise and Jason finished dinner in the kitchen. Sam seemed genuinely concerned, but there was a hesitance in his voice, as if he didn't quite know how to broach the subject. Finally, he spoke up. "Look, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I don't know why Collins thought he had the right to treat you like that. You're one of us, for crying out loud." Thornton sighed, appreciating the sentiment but knowing it was more complicated than that. "Sam, I appreciate you checking in, but it's not just about today. This happens to people all the time. It's just, most people don't expect it to happen in their own town, to someone they know." Sam looked down, fidgeting with his hands. "Yeah, I get that. I think a lot of folks around here just don't want to see it, you know. They think things like that don't happen here, or that if they do, it's because someone deserved it somehow." He paused, looking up with a troubled expression. "You think this is gonna stir things up around here?" Thornton nodded slowly. "People are already stirred up, Sam. They're just usually quiet about it. But now, people saw what happened. They can't ignore it anymore." Sam nodded, clearly uncomfortable but acknowledging the truth in Thornton's words. After a few more minutes, he excused himself, promising to be there for support if needed. As he left, Thornton was struck by the realization that Sam's visit was emblematic of the town's approach to issues of race and authority. Sympathetic but ultimately unsure, cautious and polite, but unwilling to dig deeper. The next day, Thornton received a call from Chief Wilson, the head of Riverside's police department. Chief Wilson, a man in his late 50s with a reputation for pragmatism, was known for avoiding controversy whenever possible. He had heard about the incident, and while he expressed his regret for what Thornton had experienced, his tone was cautious, clearly more concerned about the department's image than any personal apology. "James," he began, his voice measured, "I just wanted to reach out personally and let you know we'll be looking into the matter with Officer Collins. It seems there might have been a misunderstanding, but I trust we can handle this internally without it becoming more than it already is." Thornton clenched his jaw, recognizing the familiar language of deflection. "Chief, with all due respect, this wasn't a misunderstanding. Collins was profiling me, plain and simple. And I'm not the only one who's dealt with this around here. People are talking because they've experienced it too." There was a pause on the other end, the chief clearly wrestling with how to respond. "I understand, James, and we'll make sure Collins undergoes additional training if that's what it takes. But you know how these things go. Once you start stirring the pot, it's hard to control where it spills." "Chief, maybe that's exactly what needs to happen," Thornton replied, his voice firm. "People in this town deserve to know that they're safe, no matter who they are or what they look like." Chief Wilson's tone turned a bit colder. "James, I know you mean well, but Riverside isn't the city. People here don't want outside influences telling them how to run things. Let's keep this between us and work it out quietly. No need to make a scene." Thornton realized then that the conversation was over, at least from the chief's perspective. He could hear the finality in Wilson's voice, the polite but clear reminder that Riverside was a place where change moved slowly, if at all. The unspoken message was loud and clear: fit in or find somewhere else to live. But Thornton wasn't willing to let this go so easily. As he hung up, he thought about the people who had witnessed the stop, the ones who had recorded it, the ones who had already begun talking about what they saw. He knew that if he stayed silent, he'd be letting down not only himself, but everyone who had ever felt the same way in Riverside. He was a police captain, yes, but he was also a father, a husband, and a member of a community that he believed could be better. That evening, Thornton spoke with Denise about his decision to address the incident publicly. He knew it would ruffle feathers, but he also knew it was necessary. Together, they crafted a message to share with the community, urging a town hall meeting to discuss issues of fairness, policing, and mutual respect. Thornton chose his words carefully, hoping to appeal to the townspeople's sense of justice without alienating those who were resistant to change. As they hit send on the message, Thornton felt a sense of resolve. He knew that speaking out would invite backlash, perhaps even threats, but he couldn't let fear dictate his actions. He would stand up, not only for himself, but for his family and the community that deserved better. As the word spread about the town hall meeting, tension simmered throughout Riverside. Conversations buzzed in the grocery store, at the diner, and in hushed voices outside the school, where parents gathered after dropping off their kids. Thornton's message had been shared widely across social media, and it quickly became the talk of the town. For many, this was the first time someone had publicly addressed the often unspoken tensions in Riverside. Some residents welcomed the idea, feeling a long-buried frustration rise to the surface. Others, however, felt threatened, muttering about outside influence and accusing Thornton of stirring up trouble in a town that, to them, was perfectly fine just the way it was. Among those uneasy about the meeting was Officer Ray Collins himself. He had heard about the meeting and felt the weight of judgment from every corner of town. People who once nodded at him in respect now looked away, whispered in his direction, or avoided eye contact altogether. He had always thought of himself as a man upholding the law, protecting Riverside from threats, imagined or real. But now he found himself as the center of criticism, with people questioning his actions, his ethics, and even his character. The incident with Thornton had begun to haunt him. Flashes of the confrontation replayed in his mind, particularly the look on Thornton's face when he finally showed his badge. It was a look of disappointment, one that stung more than any anger or resentment ever could. Collins wasn't sure what to do, but he wasn't willing to admit fault. In his mind, he'd simply been doing his job, pulling over a driver who seemed out of place. He couldn't understand why everyone else was making such a big deal about it. Frustrated, he found himself drawn to his estranged brother, Sam, who had reached out to him after hearing about the incident. Sam was known for his progressive views, often advocating for fairness and equality. The two brothers had drifted apart over the years, partly due to these differing beliefs, but Sam had called Ray and asked to meet, saying it was important. They met at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town, far from the prying eyes of the community. Sam's expression was calm but serious as he sat across from his brother, studying him for a moment before speaking. "Ray, I think you need to face what's really happening here," Sam began, his tone firm but not accusatory. "You've got people in this town who feel like they can't even go about their lives without being treated differently because of how they look. You can't just brush that off." Ray bristled, crossing his arms defensively. "I did my job, Sam. I didn't do anything wrong. That guy was acting suspicious, and I did what I was trained to do." Sam shook his head, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "You're missing the point, Ray. James Thornton is a police captain, a good man who served his community for years. You couldn't even see that because you were so focused on what you thought he was doing wrong. You didn't give him a chance." Ray looked away, uncomfortable with the scrutiny. "People are blowing this out of proportion. I was just following protocol." "Was it really protocol, or was it your assumptions?" Sam pressed. "You don't want to see it, but you've got to understand that this goes beyond you. This is about people feeling safe in their own town. And whether you like it or not, you've become a symbol of something that needs to change." Ray's face tightened, defensive and unwilling to bend. "So now I'm the bad guy, is that it? Because I did my job." "No one's saying you're a bad guy, Ray, but you're a part of a system that needs to change, and if you can't see that, then you're only making things worse." Sam leaned forward, his voice softer now. "Ray, you need to come to that meeting. People need to see that you're willing to listen, that you're open to understanding what they're going through. Maybe it's time for you to really hear them out." Ray didn't respond, just stared at his coffee, lost in thought. The idea of sitting in that town hall, facing the community, seemed unbearable. But Sam's words lingered, forcing him to confront a reality he had always tried to ignore. Meanwhile, the day of the town hall meeting arrived, and Riverside's community center was packed with people from all walks of life: longtime residents, recent arrivals, business owners, parents, teachers, and even a few young teenagers who had come to see what all the fuss was about. The air was thick with anticipation, curiosity, and a hint of unease as people took their seats, waiting for the meeting to start. Thornton stood at the front, dressed in plain clothes but still carrying the air of authority that came naturally to him. His wife, Denise, sat in the front row, her expression a mix of pride and concern. She knew how much this meant to him and how difficult it was for him to expose himself to the scrutiny of their small town. But she also knew that he felt this was the right thing to do, that he needed to be a voice for those who felt voiceless. As the meeting began, Thornton took a deep breath and spoke, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "Thank you all for being here tonight. I know this conversation isn't easy, but it's one we need to have. This isn't just about me or what happened to me. This is about our community and whether we want to be a place where everyone feels safe, respected, and treated fairly." A murmur rippled through the crowd, with some nodding in agreement while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Thornton continued, sharing his story openly, not just about the recent traffic stop, but about the other subtler experiences he had faced since moving to Riverside. He spoke about the assumptions people made, the casual comments, the looks of surprise when he mentioned his profession, and the way those small moments added up to create a feeling of being other in a place that was supposed to be home. As he spoke, people listened intently, some visibly moved, while others looked away, uncomfortable with the truths being laid bare. Then Thornton opened the floor for others to share their experiences. One by one, people began to speak, some hesitantly at first, but gradually, the stories started to flow. A young black teacher shared how she felt scrutinized at the grocery store, as though she didn't belong. The business owner, a Latino man who had lived in Riverside for over a decade, described how he was often asked if he was legal or if he planned to go back home. These stories, painful and raw, exposed a side of Riverside that many had ignored or refused to acknowledge. Then, To everyone's surprise, Officer Collins stood up, his face pale but determined. The room fell silent as he cleared his throat, his voice shaky but resolute. "I know that a lot of you are upset with me," he began, his eyes moving across the room. "And I know that some of you probably don't think I belong here right now. But I came tonight because I realized that maybe there's something I haven't been willing to see." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I've been an officer in this town for a long time. I thought I knew Riverside, knew the people here. But listening to you all tonight, hearing your stories, it's made me realize that maybe I've been blind to things I didn't want to see. Maybe I was so focused on protecting this town in the way I thought was right that I didn't stop to think about what that meant for others." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. For many, this was the first time they had ever seen Collins vulnerable, the first time he had shown anything other than his usual no-nonsense exterior. "I can't change what happened," he continued, his voice wavering, "and I know I've got a lot to learn. But I'm here, and I'm willing to listen. I want to be a part of making things better, if you'll let me." Thornton watched Collins with a mixture of surprise and respect. He knew this couldn't have been easy for the officer, a man who had always prided himself on his authority and control. But Collins's presence, his willingness to stand before the community and acknowledge his own mistakes, was a powerful moment that shifted the energy in the room. It was a step, a small one, but a step toward healing and understanding. After Collins sat down, others continued to share, their voices stronger now, emboldened by his example. The town hall stretched late into the night, filled with stories, admissions, and promises to do better. People left the meeting with a new sense of awareness, many of them seeing their town in a new light, realizing that change was both necessary and possible. As Thornton walked out of the community center with his family, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew the journey wasn't over. This was only the beginning. But for the first time, he felt hopeful. Riverside wasn't perfect, and it had a long way to go, but tonight had shown him that people could change, that even those who seemed unwilling to listen could find the courage to face uncomfortable truths. As they drove home in silence, Jason, who had attended the meeting with them, finally spoke up, his voice filled with the innocence and honesty of a child. "Dad, does this mean Riverside is going to be a better place now?" Thornton looked at his son through the rearview mirror, his heart swelling with both pride and resolve. The aftermath of the town hall meeting rippled through Riverside with a force that no one had anticipated. The next morning, local newspapers covered the gathering on their front pages, and social media buzzed with reactions, photos, and snippets of the most impactful moments. Some posts celebrated the meeting as a turning point, a chance for Riverside to confront its uncomfortable truths. Others, however, were less positive, accusing Thornton and his supporters of tarnishing the town's reputation. Divisions grew sharper overnight as people began to pick sides, debating whether the changes discussed at the meeting were necessary or whether they would undermine the town's traditional values. Thornton felt the weight of the community's response almost immediately. He couldn't walk through town without receiving nods of support from some and cold stares from others. Denise, too, noticed the shift. Friends who had previously been warm now seemed distant, hesitant in their interactions. Thornton had anticipated some backlash, but the intensity surprised him. It was as if the town itself was struggling to choose between two identities, one that welcomed change and diversity, and another that clung to the comfort of familiarity, even if that meant overlooking the struggles of others. Meanwhile, Officer Collins faced his own storm of consequences. The days following the meeting were filled with tension at the police department. Many officers were divided on whether Collins had done the right thing by admitting his mistakes publicly. Some saw it as an act of courage, while others felt betrayed, accusing him of disloyalty to the department. Collins's reputation, once solid and unchallenged, now seemed to be teetering on the edge, with whispers among the ranks about his judgment and leadership. For the first time in his career, Collins began to question not only his actions, but also the values he'd built his life upon. The police chief, pressured by the community and the growing scrutiny of the department, decided to temporarily suspend Collins while an investigation into his conduct was conducted. Chief Wilson framed the suspension as a chance for Collins to reflect and undergo further training. Though everyone knew it was more about appeasing public opinion than any genuine commitment to reform, Collins felt humiliated, caught in a no-man's land between his personal convictions and the changing tides of the community's expectations. Yet it wasn't just Collins who was affected by the fallout. Thornton himself was facing professional consequences, albeit of a different nature. A week after the town hall, Thornton received an invitation from the Riverside mayor to discuss potential reforms within the local police department. The mayor, previously ambivalent on issues of racial bias and policing, now saw an opportunity, or perhaps felt pressured, to address these topics openly. She proposed a collaboration between Thornton's department and Riverside's, an exchange program of sorts, where officers from both towns would participate in joint workshops on bias awareness, cultural competency, and community policing. Thornton agreed, seeing it as a small but important step forward. When word of the collaboration spread, however, not everyone in Riverside was thrilled. Some residents saw it as an invasion, an outside influence, meddling in their town's affairs. They resented the idea of being told how to police their own community, especially by someone they perceived as an outsider, despite Thornton's residency and commitment to Riverside. A handful of the town's more vocal opponents to change even organized a small protest outside the police station, carrying signs that read "Keep Riverside Traditional" and "No Outsiders in Our Town." They chanted slogans, calling for Collins's reinstatement and decrying the big city influence they believed Thornton represented. Yet Thornton knew that for every person who resisted change, there were others who quietly supported it, even if they feared speaking out. He began receiving anonymous notes and messages from townsfolk who thanked him for his courage, expressing how they had experienced similar biases or felt marginalized, but had never dared to say anything. These messages, though small and private, were a source of comfort to Thornton and reminded him that the fight for progress was never easy. A few days later, a local journalist named Laura Franklin reached out to Thornton, requesting an interview for a feature she was writing on the town hall meeting and its aftermath. Laura was known in Riverside for her sharp, inquisitive mind and her ability to tackle difficult topics with compassion. Thornton agreed, meeting her at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, away from prying eyes. As they sat down, she started with a question that went beyond the usual formalities. "James, when you decided to hold that town hall, did you expect it would cause such an upheaval in Riverside?" she asked, her tone both curious and sympathetic. Thornton took a moment to consider his response. "I knew it would stir things up," he admitted, "but I didn't realize just how deeply people would feel about it. I hoped it would open eyes, make people think about how we treat each other. I guess I didn't expect such a strong backlash, though." Laura nodded, taking notes. "Some people think you're trying to change the character of Riverside, that this town's values are under threat. What would you say to them?" "I'd say that change doesn't mean losing who we are," Thornton replied, his voice steady. "It means becoming better, building on what's good and fixing what's not. Riverside can still be a close-knit community that looks out for each other, but we have to be willing to look out for everyone, not just the people who look or think the same as us." The interview lasted nearly an hour, with Thornton sharing his vision of a Riverside where people of all backgrounds felt safe and valued. Laura's article, when published, became an instant catalyst for discussion, sparking both praise and criticism. People who had previously been silent on the issue found themselves drawn into the conversation, whether at work, school, or even in their own homes. The town was at a crossroads, and every resident felt the tension of choosing a side. One evening, as Thornton and Denise were putting Jason to bed, he asked a question that caught them off guard. "Dad, are people mad at you because you told the truth?" Thornton and Denise exchanged a glance, unsure of how to answer. Thornton knelt beside Jason's bed, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes telling the truth makes people uncomfortable, especially if it's about something they don't want to see. But that doesn't mean telling the truth is wrong. Jason seemed to think this over, his young mind grappling with concepts beyond his years. Will they stop being mad someday? Thornton smiled softly. I hope so, buddy. I really do. Sometimes people just need time to understand things. And until then, we keep doing what we know is right. Meanwhile, Officer Collins, isolated and uncertain, began to experience his own transformation, albeit reluctantly. With his suspension underway, he found himself with time to reflect on the events of the past few weeks. He thought about the town hall, the stories shared, and the faces of the people who had looked at him with disappointment and frustration. He'd spent his life seeing the world through one lens, convinced of his own righteousness. But now, as he sat alone, stripped of the authority he had once taken for granted, he couldn't deny the growing doubt gnawing at him. Perhaps, just perhaps, he had been wrong. Sam continued to visit Collins, encouraging him to see the bigger picture, to understand that changing his perspective didn't mean abandoning his identity or values. Gradually, Collins began to soften, to consider the possibility that he had been too rigid, too quick to judge. Sam took him to meet with people from Riverside, who shared their own experiences with discrimination, people he would have otherwise overlooked. Hearing their stories firsthand, seeing the pain and resilience in their eyes, Collins began to feel a quiet shame creeping in, realizing that he had been blind to a reality that was all too clear to so many others. As the weeks passed, Riverside continued to grapple with its identity. The town split between those who embraced the new direction and those who clung to the past. But Thornton held firm, using every opportunity to engage with his community, attending local events, speaking with residents, and offering his support to those who felt voiceless. He knew that change wouldn't come overnight, that the road ahead was long and fraught with challenges. But with each conversation, each small gesture of understanding, he felt the barriers begin to soften, a slow but steady shift toward unity. In a surprising turn of events, Officer Collins eventually reached out to Thornton, requesting a private meeting. Thornton agreed, meeting him in a quiet park on the outskirts of town. The two men sat on a bench, the tension palpable. Collins, visibly nervous, struggled to find the words, finally looking Thornton in the eye. I've been doing a lot of thinking, he began, his voice strained but sincere. And I realize now that I made some mistakes. I let my assumptions guide me. And that's not what I signed up for when I took this job. I thought I knew everything, thought I understood people, but I didn't. Thornton listened quietly, his face calm, but Collins could see the hurt and disappointment still lingering there. I don't expect you to forgive me, Collins continued, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying to do better. I'm trying to learn, to change. And if there's any way I can make things right, I want to. Thornton looked at him, a long silence stretching between them before he finally spoke. Ray, it's not about forgiving or forgetting. It's about making sure this never happens again, to anyone. If you're serious about making things right, then start by treating everyone in this town with the respect they deserve. That's all any of us want. The two men sat in silence, a quiet understanding passing between them. They both knew that healing would take in the following months. Riverside felt the changes that had been ignited by the town hall and the powerful conversations that ensued. The police department began implementing small but significant reforms, influenced by the collaboration between Thornton's department and Riverside's police force. These reforms included regular bias and sensitivity training, community policing initiatives, and an open-door policy for civilians to voice their concerns directly to the department. While these changes were met with mixed reactions, they slowly began to reshape the community's relationship with law enforcement, fostering an environment where residents could feel heard and respected. Thornton watched these changes unfold with a cautious optimism. He knew that change, especially in a town as close-knit as Riverside, was a delicate process, and progress would be gradual. However, he also felt the shift in the air, a subtle yet undeniable sense that the town was on the cusp of something better, something more inclusive and understanding. The once simmering tension was beginning to ease, replaced by a hesitant but hopeful curiosity as residents began to question their own preconceptions and assumptions. One day, Thornton received an unexpected invitation to speak at Riverside High School. The school's principal, inspired by the recent events and their impact on the town, wanted Thornton to share his experiences and insights with the students, hoping it would encourage them to think critically about community, fairness, and respect. Thornton accepted, feeling both honored and slightly nervous. He understood the importance of reaching young people, especially in a town where generations tended to follow in the footsteps of their parents and grandparents. If Riverside were to truly evolve, it needed to start with the younger generation. On the day of his visit, Thornton entered the school's auditorium to find it filled with students, some watching him with open curiosity, others with a wary skepticism. He began by recounting his journey into law enforcement, describing his initial motivations to make a difference, to serve and protect his community. He spoke of his career in the city, the challenges he faced, and the satisfaction he felt each time he made a positive impact. Then, he shared his experiences since moving to Riverside, the challenges of being seen as an outsider despite his dedication to the town, and the turning point that had come with the encounter during the traffic stop. As he spoke, he could see the expressions of the students changing, some leaning forward, engaged, while others whispered to each other, the significance of his words slowly sinking in. Thornton then opened the floor for questions, inviting the students to share their thoughts and ask anything they wanted, no matter how uncomfortable or challenging. The students' questions ranged from the straightforward to the deeply personal. Some asked about what it was like to be a police officer, while others questioned how he dealt with biases, both from others and potentially from within himself. One student, a quiet boy named Jordan, who had experienced his own struggles with bullying due to his ethnicity, asked a question that struck a chord with Thornton. "How do you stay hopeful, Captain Thornton, when it feels like no one wants things to change?" Thornton paused, taken aback by the boy's insight, then answered honestly, "Hope isn't something that comes easily, Jordan. It's something you have to work for, to protect, even when others don't see the need for it. But every small step, every act of kindness, every moment where you stand up for what's right, it all adds up. Change is slow, but it's worth fighting for. And I see the hope right here, in you and your classmates. You have the power to shake this town, to make it a place that welcomes everyone." The auditorium filled with a soft murmur of appreciation, and as the students filed out, several of them approached Thornton, thanking him for his words. He left the school that day feeling a renewed sense of purpose, realizing that even if the road was long, Riverside had a future that was beginning to look brighter. Meanwhile, Officer Collins continued his journey of introspection and growth. His suspension had ended, but the experience had changed him. While he had once viewed the world in stark terms of right and wrong, he was beginning to understand the nuances he had previously ignored. Conversations with his brother Sam had opened his eyes, revealing a world of perspectives he had never considered. Though Collins was still wary, he found himself engaging more with people he'd previously overlooked. Individuals whose experiences didn't fit into the narrow worldview he once held. One evening, Collins took a bold step and attended a local community gathering held in one of Riverside's small community centers. He arrived quietly, almost hoping to slip in unnoticed, but his presence quickly drew attention. Some attendees eyed him warily, unsure of his intentions, while others simply ignored him. But as the evening wore on, Collins began to engage in conversation, listening intently as people shared their stories, their struggles, and their hopes for Riverside. He found himself speaking with a woman named Maria, who had lived in Riverside for over 20 years, but had never felt fully accepted. Maria spoke of how her children faced discrimination at school, how she constantly felt the need to prove herself to neighbors who questioned her place in the community. Collins listened, absorbing her words, feeling the weight of her experiences settle over him. In that moment, he understood the true impact of his actions, the pain that people carried, and the responsibility he had as an officer to be more than just an enforcer of rules. Maria's story stayed with him, sparking a quiet resolve to do better, to be better. Collins began attending more community meetings, often in plain clothes, blending in as best as he could, his presence becoming less intimidating and more familiar. Over time, he became a regular, someone who listened rather than judged, who contributed to the discussions with humility rather than authority. His transformation was gradual but undeniable, and people began to see him not as the rigid officer they once feared, but as someone willing to evolve and learn. Thornton watched Collins's journey from afar, impressed by his gradual change. Though he hadn't forgotten the initial encounter that sparked everything, he was proud to see Collins embracing a different path, one that aligned with the values they were working to foster in Riverside. Their relationship remained formal, tinged with the tension of their past, but there was an unspoken understanding between them now, a respect that came from shared experiences, and a mutual desire to see their town become a better place. As the months wore on, the reforms within Riverside's police department took root, subtly shifting the culture within the force. Younger officers, inspired by Thornton's example and Collins's transformation, began to approach their roles with more empathy and awareness. The department introduced community liaison officers who regularly attended town meetings, bridging the gap between the police and the people they served. And while Riverside was far from perfect, there was a sense of progress, a fragile but growing belief that change was possible. One evening, as Thornton walked through Riverside's downtown area with his family, he saw a gathering forming outside the community center. Curious, they joined the crowd, finding that it was a celebration of Riverside's diverse heritage, a new tradition that had emerged from the town's recent journey toward understanding and inclusivity. The event featured food, music, and stories from the many different cultures that called Riverside home, and people mingled freely, laughing, dancing, and sharing their lives with one another. Thornton spotted Collins among the crowd, chatting with Maria, the woman he'd once spoken to at the community meeting. The two were laughing, and Collins looked genuinely at ease, a far cry from the tense, guarded man Thornton had first encountered. It was a small but powerful moment, a symbol of how far Riverside had come and the possibilities that lay ahead. As the night wore on, Thornton found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them all here, the confrontations, the pain, the struggles, and the victories, both big and small. He felt a sense of pride and hope, a belief that Riverside was finally embracing the potential he had always seen in it. As they walked home, his son Jason looked up at him with a question in his eyes. "Dad, do you think Riverside will always be like this now?" Thornton smiled, placing a reassuring hand on Jason's shoulder. "I think Riverside will always be growing, learning. It may not be perfect, but as long as there are people here who care, who want to make it better, I believe it'll be a place where everyone belongs." In that moment, Thornton felt a profound sense of peace. The journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges, setbacks, and resistance to change. But the town had taken its first unsteady steps toward unity, and that was enough for now. The seeds of understanding had been planted, nurtured by the courage of those willing to speak out and the humility of those willing to listen. As they made their way home, Thornton knew that Riverside's story was far from finished, but it was a story he was proud to be a part of, a story that held the promise of a brighter, more inclusive future for everyone. Months passed, and Riverside gradually settled into its new rhythm, adapting to the changes that had been set in motion. Thornton had become a familiar face not just in the local police force, but also throughout the town. He was invited to more community events, consulted on local policies, and often called upon by residents who had questions or concerns. It was a surprising turn for a man who had once been seen as an outsider, a change agent whose presence some had resisted. Now he was becoming a symbol of Riverside's evolving identity, a beacon for those who believed in the power of inclusivity and understanding. The town's changes, though subtle, were evident in everyday interactions. People were more open, more willing to engage in conversations that once would have been avoided. Local businesses started putting up signs that read, "Everyone welcome," and community events began to feature a broader range of cultural celebrations. Schools in Riverside began including discussions on diversity and empathy in their curricula, inviting speakers from different backgrounds to share their stories. Slowly, the town was weaving a new narrative, one in which all voices were valued and respected. Yet, as with any change, not everyone was content. Some of Riverside's more traditional residents still clung to the belief that the town was losing its true character. They muttered about the good old days, reminiscing about a time when life was simpler, as they put it. These residents often viewed the changes with suspicion, worried that Riverside's charm was being sacrificed for ideals they felt had no place in their community. However, even among them, there was a softening, a gradual recognition that perhaps the town could hold on to its charm while still growing into something more inclusive. Thornton had a close eye on this transformation, and though he was heartened by the positive changes, he remained vigilant. He knew that change was fragile, that progress could be easily undermined if the community's commitment wavered. He saw this most clearly in the interactions within the police department. Many of the younger officers embraced the new training and community-building efforts wholeheartedly, inspired by Thornton's example and the openness they saw developing in the town. But some of the older officers remained skeptical, adhering to the familiar practices and routines they'd followed for years. Thornton understood their resistance. It was difficult for anyone to unlearn habits that had been ingrained over a lifetime. But he also recognized that the department's success depended on unity and a willingness to grow. Officer Collins, once the staunchest critic of change, had now become an unlikely advocate. His journey from resistance to acceptance hadn't been easy, but it was real. He started attending community meetings regularly, not as an officer but as a resident, listening to the concerns of his neighbors, answering questions, and sharing his own journey of self-reflection. His willingness to admit his mistakes and commit to doing better had a powerful impact, especially on those who had once felt alienated by his actions. Collins became a bridge between the old Riverside and the new, an example of how even the most resistant hearts could open when met with understanding and patience. One day, Collins approached Thornton with a proposal that caught him by surprise. "Captain Thornton," he began, still formal out of habit, though their relationship had grown significantly warmer over the months. "I've been thinking, maybe we could start a program that pairs officers with members of the community for monthly meetups. You know, just a way for people to get to know each other outside of the job. I feel like we're still not seeing each other as people." Thornton considered this, intrigued. "You mean like a buddy system?" "Exactly," Collins replied. "If officers and residents could sit down over coffee or take a walk around town, they might start seeing things differently. It's a lot harder to judge someone when you know their story." Thornton nodded, impressed by the idea. "That's a great thought, Ray. Building relationships instead of enforcing boundaries. I think it could make a real difference." With Chief Wilson's reluctant approval, the program was launched as a pilot, and Collins volunteered to be one of the first participants. He was paired with Maria, the woman he had once spoken with at a community meeting, whose story had opened his eyes to the impact of his actions. At first, their meetings were polite but guarded, both feeling the weight of their past encounter. But over time, as they shared stories about their families, their struggles, and their hopes for the future, they began to genuinely connect. Maria learned that Collins had grown up in Riverside, the son of a single mother who had instilled in him a strict sense of right and wrong. Collins, in turn, heard about Maria's journey as an immigrant, the hardships she had faced in building a life for herself and her children, and the resilience that had carried her through. Their relationship blossomed into a friendship that went beyond their initial interactions, symbolizing the town's broader transformation. Through Collins and Maria, Others in the program began to see the value in stepping outside of their comfort zones. The buddy system became so successful that it was eventually adopted by the entire police department, evolving into a cornerstone of Riverside's community policing efforts. Officers were encouraged to engage in these partnerships as a way to understand the town they served, and residents began to see the police not as authority figures, but as neighbors, people with whom they shared a common bond. As the buddy program grew, Thornton took another step toward cementing the changes within the community by proposing a yearly Unity Day, a town-wide event celebrating Riverside's diversity and commitment to inclusion. The town council supported the idea, and in its first year, Unity Day became a resounding success. The event featured food from local vendors representing various cultural backgrounds, performances by local musicians and artists, and speeches from residents who shared their journeys of acceptance and growth. Families from all parts of Riverside attended, mingling, laughing, and forming connections that went beyond superficial interactions. Collins and Maria volunteered to speak together at Unity Day, their story serving as a powerful example of reconciliation and friendship born from understanding. They spoke about how their relationship had evolved, how they had learned to see each other as individuals rather than symbols of their respective roles. Their speech moved the crowd, drawing tears and applause, and their story became an inspiration for others who still struggled to let go of old prejudices. Thornton, watching from the sidelines with Denise and Jason, felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The town he had once been wary of was now thriving in ways he could have only dreamed of. Riverside was no longer just a town that tolerated differences. It was a place that celebrated them, a community that had embraced the difficult but rewarding journey toward unity. Later that evening, as Thornton and his family walked home, they passed by a group of young teens, some of whom were the same students he had spoken to months earlier at Riverside High School. The teens waved, calling out to him, "Thanks for everything, Captain Thornton." Their words, spoken with genuine gratitude and admiration, warmed his heart. Back at home, Jason looked up at him with wide eyes. "Dad, I want to be like you when I grow up." Thornton knelt down beside his son, his voice soft but steady. "Jason, you can be anything you want to be. But remember, being a good person, someone who treats others with respect and kindness. That's what really matters, no matter what you choose to do." As Jason nodded, his eyes shining with admiration, Thornton felt a profound sense of peace. He had fought hard to make Riverside a place where his son could grow up without fear, in a town that welcomed all people. He knew the journey wasn't over. There would always be work to do, progress to make, and challenges to face. But he also knew that Riverside was stronger, more resilient, and more united than it had ever been. In the months that followed, Unity Day became an annual tradition, a celebration that drew people from neighboring towns, curious to witness the transformation that Riverside had undergone. The town's story spread, becoming a symbol of how small communities could address their biases and work toward meaningful change. Thornton's impact extended far beyond Riverside, inspiring other towns to start similar programs and fostering a wave of understanding and empathy that reached across the region. Thornton continued his work, always driven by the belief that one person, one conversation, one small act of kindness could make a difference. His journey had taught him that true change was never easy, that it required resilience, patience, and an open heart. But he had also learned that it was possible, that even the most divided communities could come together when people were willing to see each other as individuals, to listen and to understand. As he looked out over Riverside, he felt a deep sense of pride and hope for the future. This was the town he had dreamed of, a place where everyone belonged, where every voice was heard, and where every individual mattered. And he knew that, as long as there were people like Collins, Maria, and the countless others who had embraced the journey toward unity, Riverside would continue to grow, flourish, and stand as a testament to the power of community and the strength of the human spirit.